In this video, I want to give you a brief introduction to the letter of 1 Corinthians. So, 1 Corinthians is another letter that was written by the Apostle Paul, and he was writing to the church at Corinth. And Paul actually had a very extensive history with the church here. So he had actually established this church on his second missionary journey, and you can see, you can read through this whole account in Acts 15 through 18. And Paul had spent around 18 months at this church ministering to them, encouraging them, and building them up, working so that they would mature in their faith. And it's interesting because the church was made up mostly of people that had converted from pagan religions. So you kind of have this melting pot of people in the Corinth church that Paul really witnessed to and stayed for quite a while to try to benefit the church. So then the date of this letter is believed to be around 55 AD. As I was saying, there seems to be quite an extensive historical backdrop as far as Paul's relationship with the Corinth church. So I had just said that Paul founded this church on his second missionary journey. Well, then on his third missionary journey, Paul was in Ephesus and he began to hear that the church in Corinth was having some trouble. So this is kind of where things get interesting. Paul seems to have written a short letter to correct the issues that he had heard were going on. So he hears while he's in Ephesus of problems in the church. Then he writes a letter to them to encourage them to work out those issues. But we do not have this letter. And Paul actually states this in 1 Corinthians 5:9. He alludes to this letter that he had written that we no longer have. But then Paul received a letter from the Corinth church that seems to have included a list of questions that the members in the church had. So 1 Corinthians is then a response to that letter, along with some added things in there that Paul needed to highlight. So the primary reason for writing is that the Corinthian church members were acting as spiritual children instead of mature Christians. So Paul, as I said, had spent a whole lot of time, over a year, close to a year and a half, ministering to these people, and then he begins to hear that they're acting as if they are spiritual children, as if they are still very much new converts. And so Paul addresses the problems in the church and encourages them to grow in their faith, to become mature. And so then the key theme is divisions in the church. Paul calls the church to be unified in mind and thought, and that's actually a key verse there in chapter 1, verse 10. So then the structure we see is kind of divided in half. The first half, chapters 1 through 6, is addressing problems within the church. So this is more likely Paul addressing issues that he had heard of, issues that he knew of. And then the second half, in chapters 7 through 16, Paul is addressing questions within the church. So here he's probably responding to the questions that the Corinth church had sent to him in a letter. So here he's just kind of going through the list, it seems, of their questions and providing answers for them. And then finally, 1 Corinthians includes the famous love chapter in chapter 13. If you've been to any weddings throughout your life, there's a decent-sized chance that you have heard this chapter read aloud. It's as it says, it's a pretty famous chapter. And then second, 1 Corinthians gives the most systematic defense of the resurrection in all of the New Testament. So that gives you just a very brief overview of kind of the introductory information for 1 Corinthians and why Paul was writing. And so now you should be good to go to dive into this book.